This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, what we're looking at today is sort of the beginnings of looking at a geography of the Book of Mormon and trying to decide where we could look in the world to find out where to assess the text of the Book of Mormon against history to see how well it works. So get back over to the slideshow here. Okay. Before I start with anything, one of the reasons why I need to do this is that it is very easy to look at the reasons why we would see the Book of Mormon as, let's say, a 19th century production. And we've looked at language as one of those reasons. And there are lots of reasons to see the language of the Book of Mormon as something that was produced around Joseph Smith's time. So the question then is, if the language is produced at that time, does it mean that all of the text was produced at that time? And of course, there are lots of arguments that will indicate that it was. And the question is, how do we evaluate any of them? And the real question will be, can we come up with competing theories? Because if the best explanation is that everything was created in the 19th century and we cannot support any historical text or any history behind the text, then we go with the 19th century production. But we can't make that discernment unless we can look at history. And we can't really look at history unless we've got a place to look at. So without actually coming to a conclusion about geography, and also obviously this is not doctrine of the church to tell us where the geography of the Book of Mormon took place. But without having a place to go against, we can't really build a historical case to say that the Book of Mormon took place in some location. If the Book of Mormon could have taken place anywhere in the world and we could make it fit, then it may not fit anywhere in the world. We have to have some legitimate location against which to check the text, the events, the timetables, all of its descriptions. We need to be able to compare that to a particular location to see how well it fits. And then, and only then, will we have any opportunity to talk about history or historicity. As long as what we're doing is simply throwing darts at a dartboard and saying, there's a hole in the ground over here and that must have been a baptismal font, we haven't moved away from the bad arguments that we have seen for a long time in looking at the Book of Mormon. So we need something more solid than that. So the first thing is, my cursor over here so it'll change something. There we go. So the first thing is, what I want to do is run through some of the possible geographies, but before doing that, I want to have some principles in place so that when I look at one, I know that I am looking at principles that will help me examine it without submitting them only to my prejudices for where I would prefer the Book of Mormon to have taken place. So I need to have some sort of an analytical tool where I can look at them and say, yeah, let me compare this to a certain set of criteria, and that will let me know how well things are going to work. So that's the first part of what we want to look at, is this sort of set of criteria. Now, one of the things in the criterion, these criteria all have to base themselves on the facts that the text is going to be the ultimate guide. So we need to get the information from the text of the Book of Mormon. There are so many places in the Book of Mormon where you can extract from the text information that will tell you something about geography, geology, hydrology, something on climate, certainly a lot on culture, and episodes, time periods, and things that are happening in different time periods. There's so much of that that's saying, well, we're going to use the text as a guide. That's too much. We can't really use all of those things. We need something that'll weed things out a little bit faster. So what this guide does is it gives us a tool to be able to kind of weed things out so that then we can say, here's a place that looks like it may work. Now let's go deeper into the text and see what we can find. So first principle would be fairness. If I'm going to approach any of these things, I have to assume that I have some beliefs about Book of Mormon geography that might color the way I see them. And I have to be fair to anybody's model or hypothesis. So to be fair, one of the things that I do is I simply accept the premises that they're using about distances. Distances are really critical. If we are using walking distances, that will make a big difference in how far apart various things are. If for some reason we use another model, and let's say it's an automobile, which of course they would not have had, but you can travel a lot farther in an automobile than you can travel walking. What we'll look at in one of the geographies is that the distances are being calculated based on riverine travel. And they're saying they were traveling by boat, and by boat you're going to travel farther than you would by walking. And so that allows that particular model to be larger than many of the other ones. And so we have to at least begin with that hypothesis to at least give it an opportunity to be correct. You have to accept the model's location as being at least plausible. Somebody thought it was a good argument, and so we need to consider it reasonably to see how well it's going to fit with what information we have from the text. And then we have to find out whether or not it will describe the world as it existed in Book of Mormon times. And you'll see as we go into some of these why I make that particular statement. The next several things is that there are layers of information that we have to have in order to find a match between the text and any particular geography. One of them is a geographic layer. So there's going to be relationships between lands. We've got certain kinds of geographic features that we have to have. And everybody who has ever done a Book of Mormon geography knows that they have to find a narrow neck. And I have seen enough of them to know that everybody defines narrow neck differently. One of the ones that we'll see actually has a difference between a narrow neck and a small neck of land, having those two things in two different places. So the question then becomes, what else do you have? So if you're going to have a narrow neck of land, everybody goes for the big pieces. What else can we use as a pretty good model to be able to tell us what we need to know? Well, another one is the location of seas. The Book of Mormon has events that occur on the West Sea and on the East Sea. And a lot of people will talk about the idea that you need a North and a South Sea. What happens in the text of the Book of Mormon, though, is that we will see events and cities lined up on the West Sea. We will see them on the coast or somewhere close to the shore on the East Sea. We will never see any action in the text that happens on the South Sea. We never see any action in the text that happens on the North Sea. So even if somebody comes up with a model that says, yeah, I've got North and South, they need to particularly pay attention to East and West. And there have to be cities on the West Coast and on the East Coast that those people can get to. And so those seas are going to define, again, depending on how far you can walk in a day or whether the rivers are, that will sort of set some boundaries for what we can see in the Book of Mormon. The next one that I like is a Manti test. Everybody looks for East and West Seas. Everybody looks for a narrow neck of land. They're going to find a river Sidon. They will find a place that they are comfortable with for a Zarahemla. They'll find all these big places, Bountiful, Land of Desolation, Land Northward. They tend to ignore Manti. Manti, however, is a place where we have a lot of geographic information that tells us something about that city, that we can use that city that tends to be neglected as a test point. So if we take that city, we say, here are the things that it has to have. This model doesn't care. and doesn't have any of them, then they've skipped over a really important piece of the geography as mentioned in the Book of Mormon. So what are those for the city of Manti? The city of Manti is an important defensive position that appears to control and call it a pass for lack of any other term that we could use. It controls the main pass or passageway from the land from the the Lamanite land south of Zarahemla into the land of Zarahemla. So it's somewhere near the head of the Sidon, however somebody wants to define the head of the Sidon. But there is an indication that the preferred way to get from the land of Nephi into the land of Zarahemla is to go through this one location, which suggests that it isn't on a plain. That suggests that it's probably in a mountain range and that there is a pass, and that it is that particular path that makes it easy to get from one to the other. And Manti is there as an important defensive position that was sufficiently important that Lamanites had a hard time skipping it. If they were going to invade, it could easily cut off their supply lines. They had to take care of getting that city and at least neutralizing that defensive point. So if we cannot find a city of Manti that's in a good defensive position that controls the major way between the land of Nephi and the land of Zarahemla, we haven't found the right one. There is another text that strongly suggests that there is an east-west path, or valley that travels from east to west that the Lamanites used at one point in time in order to get back to Nephi. They had come into the eastern coast. They were attacked and rebuffed in that northeastern section of the land of Zarahemla. They come down. They have to go through this passageway heading from the east to the west to get to Manti, and they want to try again to conquer, but now they're coming through Manti. There is some barrier that keeps them from being able to get to that location as quickly as Moroni, Captain Moroni. He finds out about it. He goes and talks to Alma. However long this takes, Alma, as a prophet, tells him where they're going, and Moroni is able to apparently go up the River Sidon Valley and get to Manti prior to the time that the Nephites who had a head start, the Lamanites who had a head start. So this east-west valley is really an important characteristic. Okay, next thing, geological layer. So we've got the geographic layer. On top of that, we have another requirement of geology. And in general, one of the things that's really important is just land elevation. And one of the things that we find is that the land of Nephi is always at a higher elevation than the land of Zarahemla. Now, a lot of this is the up to and down to. So if anybody's model is going to suggest that the land of Zarahemla is in a higher elevation, they have to find some way to redefine those terms to change how you have that relationship. But that also makes a big difference for the River Sidon. If the River Sidon has its head somewhere south of Zarahemla, and south of Zarahemla the land is at a higher elevation, it's pretty simple to let us know that the River Sidon is going to flow somewhere northward. And there are many, many geographies that will have the River Sidon east to west. It'll go from north to south. However they have it, they have to be able to justify it and to be able to figure out how it fits into those elevations. The next thing that's really important is we have all of the events from 3rd Nephi. They have to be explained. They have to have some logical conclusion. And all of the geologists who have looked at those events tell us that those events fit a particular kind of volcanic explosion, and perhaps even more than one at a similar time. So we've got these events. Somehow we have to find a way that there is volcanic activity or something else that somebody could use to define it that would explain how that area of the world is going to be affected by the cataclysms that we see in 3rd Nephi. They have to occur. And according to the text, the destruction is happening both south and north of the land of Bountiful. So we've got those two things going on. We need to know how it is that you're going to have destruction on the north and the south, and perhaps not in Bountiful. How does that happen? Next one, human population. The very simple one on this one is that you really have to have people living there. If you find an absolutely beautiful geographic correlation and everything else worked, but nobody lived there, you've got the wrong place. And saying that you just haven't found them yet is a really bad excuse. We have done enough archaeological work throughout the world that we have a general idea of places where there were people living. So some have been excavated better than others, but if there was a significant population, it would be shocking if we did not already know that there was a significant population there. And so if you come up with a wonderful geography and just don't have the people, still don't have the right place. The next thing that's really important is the Book of Mormon speaks of fairly large populations. And we know, based on anthropology and history, that you cannot have a large population unless you have a stable agricultural base that gives you sufficient calories to support that population. If you have an agricultural base with sufficient calories in it, then you do not even have to have very many calories coming from animals. So the hunting isn't necessarily all that important. So the great civilizations, for example, of Mesoamerica are based on corn, squash, and beans, and not on meat. And meat was rare, didn't have it very often. But you've got to have that agricultural base. So again, if we find a culture where we say, yeah, there were people there, and we find out that the agriculture they had did not supply sufficient calories to support a large population, we've still got the wrong place. All right, simple one, Book of Mormon requires literacy. That gets to be very difficult to find in the New World, but certainly it would be a plus if we could find any area of the world that had literacy. And at the moment, there is only one general area that we know of that had multiple writing systems. Nobody else had writing. That is at least an indication, probably not as strong as some of the other ones, but it's an indication to look for. Now, the next thing is, once we've got these populations, if we can get down to this level, the Book of Mormon tells us that there were different peoples that were in different parts of the land, and they were there at different time periods. And so the three sets of people that the Book of Mormon is concerned with, these three immigrant populations, are the Jaredites, the Nephite Lamanites, and the Mulekites. And they have a geographic interrelationship. So in the north are Jaredites, somewhere in the middle are Mulekites, and down in the south there are Lamanites and Nephites. And then at some point in time, the Nephites, of course, are kicked out of this land of Nephi. They move up into the central section where they meet with the Mulekites. And the only time we hear of anybody from the Jaredites meeting up with anybody else is the story of Coriantumr, where we have one man who comes to that center section, and that's before the Nephites ever show up. And so one of the requirements of the text is Nephites don't ever meet Jaredites. They're not in the same land. It's considered a completely different place. Mormon is very, very clear that he separates the land of the Jaredites from anything that the Nephites have. And he calls it the land northward. And then when he really gets into it, he calls it the land desolation. and he has some reasons for doing that. But those interrelationships are really, really important, and so we have to find, if we can, those connections. All right. Let's go back. Yeah. What did I do? Yeah, last one down here, requirements of Helaman 3. Helaman 3 is fascinating because it is a time when we have a textual description of a location that gives us a set of coordinated features to look for. So it talks about being northward from the lands of Nephi. So if wherever you put the land of Nephi, you find the rest of these things to the south, wrong place, won't find it. The next thing is, we all understand and remember that it talks about cement. But if you're just looking for cement and you say, well, I found a place that has cement, that isn't sufficient, because the text requires that there are an interrelated set of conditions that go with cement. So it has to be northward of the Nephite lands. It has to be in a land of many waters. It has to be denuded of trees, which is one of the reasons why they use cement. And so there's that set of conditions. If you find a place that has a massive forest and they use something that you think you can call cement, that's nice, not the right place. If at the time of the Book of Mormon, there were trees there. And we can tell from pollen and other indications archaeologically whether or not there were forests at a particular point in time. So that's another one that becomes a really important criterion that can be applied to any model. So now, there's one more. The one I like is one I call productivity. If I find a model, if it is a good model and has any chance at all of being the place where the Book of Mormon took place, then it should be a productive model, in that it should start to explain the unstated culture behind the Book of Mormon. I've talked about this before, and I'll just mention it again. If someone is writing fiction, one of the things that they have to do is build the world. If it's a place that you don't know about, there is a lot of world building and description that goes on. One of the places to see this, the manuscript found has been suggested as a possible source for the Book of Mormon. And the manuscript found was found. And so we have that. You can get a copy of it. I think it's even available electronically now, and you can read the manuscript found and decide for yourself if it has any kind of connection to the Book of Mormon. One of the places where it is distinctly different from the Book of Mormon is that there was a lot of descriptive language. They will talk about what people wore, what they looked like, and there's a whole bunch of world building that goes on that you don't get in the Book of Mormon. It is very rare to get world building in the Book of Mormon. So it doesn't tell you its culture. It doesn't give you descriptions. If we can find a place that, because we have set it in that place, the time periods, the place, the culture starts to work, then we can take the information that we know about the culture, start reapplying it to the Book of Mormon. And if that starts to elucidate the text in ways that we would not otherwise know, that's again a good indication that we've found the place where we should be concentrating to find out whether or not the Book of Mormon is historical. All right, walking through some of these. It's very important to begin with kind of the general idea of the text, and the best place to go for that is at the BYU Virtual Book of Mormon. If you look up, BYU Virtual Book of Mormon, Virtual Scriptures, you'll find eventually this site. And I suggest that you do it if you have any interest at all in Book of Mormon geography, even if you don't care about a particular geography. This is the general map that they come up with. But what they've done is, more importantly than just give you a map, there is an apparatus that goes with this that will move through time. And so if you select, for example, First Nephi, well, let's take Second Nephi, because First Nephi mostly is going to appear in the Old World. But if you take Second Nephi, it will start to show us, let me get back here, information about the land of Nephi, but not a lot happening up here because the Book of Mormon doesn't take place there. And as you move through each one of the chapters, as new things happen, you will see them begin to appear on the map. Really a very, very useful tool. It is, of course, free. There's some thing where you download it on a phone, on a computer, but really a nice generic look at the Book of Mormon, which is still important because it'll move through time and show you interactions or interrelationships of the locations. Now, what they have done with this is they've taken the basic information from the text and tried to put it into a generic location where this doesn't represent anything in the real world, but it does represent the kinds of things that are important. And they've passed it around to several geographers to get their feedback on what is required. So very obviously it has a narrow neck of land. It has the land bountiful here and the land desolation. There is a dividing line between the two, and that's exactly what the text requires. It does talk about cities on the eastern seashore and on the west. It has a mountain range running from the east to the west, and somewhere in here a valley that you can get through. We've got Manti that is somewhere in a strategic position between the north and the south. So it's got a pretty good indication of where these relative things are. And it'll give you a model that you could use where you could use this to say, how well does something else fit up once I get it into the real world? Now, some of the other ones, South America. The South American geographies all focus on Peru. And they focus on that area and maybe a little bit more. And the reason is when you get down to that layer that we were talking about, the human population, that's where you get really good information. There were some very high societies going on there, lots of population. They have the agriculture, they have the population, they have the complex political systems. All of that works. The problem is you have to have everything working, every one of those layers. And the problem, as you can see here, is in order to get an east and west sea, most of the people that are using the Peruvian model tend to want to sink underwater an area of South America that we know was not underwater during Book of Mormon times. So you'll remember I said one of the beginning criteria was to be able to say it has to represent the world at the time of the Book of Mormon. This doesn't. This doesn't say, there just isn't a time historically where we can find that this area was underwater. In fact, we know there are people living there during Book of Mormon times, which kind of precludes it from being underwater, which means even though this looks like it works and it's got a really good indication of the cultural information, the geography falls apart, and so we can't really use it. No matter how good the rest of the textual information is and the culture and everything else isn't going to work because the geography doesn't work. The next thing that doesn't work is we haven't been able to find the volcanic activities to explain Third Nephi here. So although we have suggestions for the Book of Mormon in that area, they just don't meet enough of the criteria to be useful. Next one that's been kind of popular is the Great Lakes area. And one of the ones, by the way, that I didn't put here is the one that was prevalent at the beginning of the Book of Mormon. So sort of the 1830 to 1870 popular model of the geography of the Book of Mormon, which is the entire Western Hemisphere, with the Isthmus of Panama being the narrow neck of land. There are a lot of geographies that were set up for that. In 1879, Orson Pratt put in the footnotes references to geographical locations where he would identify them based on the fact that he thought it was the entire hemisphere. that simply doesn't work. There's no way that we can get any population that covers that amount of distance. It was good only if you didn't actually try to put human beings on the map and have them perform the actions that we see in the text. So I had to put that one on there because it just doesn't solve anything. So Great Lakes was another one. The advantage of the Great Lakes hypothesis is that you get to have Cumorah in New York. And of course, a lot of people really, really, really want Cumorah to be in New York. And we'll talk about that, I guess, in a moment. But the Great Lakes version, there's a couple of them. The one on the left is from Phyllis Olive. She's probably the one, at least that I know of, that has done more work with this particular model than anyone else. And you'll see a couple of differences with what happens in this other one that I don't know who did that one. Couple of things that are important to look at. One of them, we've got the land of Cumorah over here. And then let's see, let's get up this way. We've got the land northward and Cumorah over here. And this is Lake Ontario. The land northward is north of Cumorah. Well, that's a real problem because in the text of the Book of Mormon, in order to get to Cumorah, the Nephites had to go through the narrow neck of land into the land northward, and Cumorah is in the land northward, which means somewhere south we have to have a narrow neck. Narrow neck can't be north of Cumorah, it can't be west of Cumorah. It has to be somehow south of Cumorah. So this one's having problems already. You'll notice that we get a C north, which is really nice, except we don't have any action happening there. The C west, you'll notice the C west and the C south are kind of, you got your C south to the west of the C west. And the C east is actually north of everything that's happening in the Book of Mormon. So you can label things, but they don't fit with the descriptions. You're supposed to have cities along the C east, and they're all south of Cumorah. None of these things work. You cannot match them up. Now, if you tried to say, well, maybe I could stretch things a little bit and give them the benefit of the doubt, and then I said, let's look at the human population. The very first thing you know from archaeology is that you just don't have the populations there. During Book of Mormon times, this was a very thinly populated area. It was heavily forested. You're not going to find any place. I mean, you find land of lots of waters. That's not a problem. But trees were well in abundance, and there was no reason to build with cement. So yeah, this just isn't going to work. Agriculturally, they didn't have the base of agriculture. They're hunter-gatherers. So there's just nothing about this model that combines all of those pieces. Even if you can make one or two of them work, not enough of them work that this is a viable option. The biggest benefit is that it places the events somewhere around the New York Hill Cumorah, and that's the only thing it's got going for it. Other than that, there really isn't anything else that fits the Book of Mormon text. Baja theory. This is a relatively new one. So in the Baja theory, that's Baja California. And I listened to a YouTube discussion where the guy was saying, here's the advantages we have. And he tried to talk about how he interpreted the text to say that the text would require a pretty arid land. All of that's fine, but what about the other criteria that we have? Well, there isn't a very good narrow neck of land here. We've got a land bountiful and a land desolation, but that's not much of a narrow neck in between them. It doesn't look like there's any barrier that we have to worry about. And then the other thing that happens on this one, of course, you'll notice that because it's a peninsula, you've got the land of Nephi down here. Well, to the south of the land of Nephi, you have the land of the Lamanites, and the Lamanites outnumbered the Nephites. So in this area up here, you're supposed to have the Nephite nation, which is much, much smaller than the people who are living down here. It doesn't give them enough space. It doesn't give them place to be. Now, archaeologically, they weren't there. This was definitely a thinly populated land. So even if we could make every other piece of geography work, there are no people here. There's no civilizations. And I have heard the argument that, well, we just haven't looked for them yet. That's not the right answer. We have looked well enough to know that they're not there. And what has been found is much smaller communities, and like you would expect from an arid piece of land that frankly isn't a place you'd really want to. If you had a better way to make a living, you'd have gone to a better place than Baja. So that one just isn't going to work. Now, do we get any of the geology of Third Nephi here? Nothing there either. So they're, other than trying to make this fit, there are just too many pieces that don't fit and won't allow us to use those criteria that have to be layered together. Those are not separate things. Those are intersecting pieces of information that all have to fit together in order to have a geography of the Book of Mormon. Heartland theory. This one is becoming very, very popular. Somewhat to my chagrin, I would say. It's almost sad that this is as popular as it is, because there are so many more members of the church now who would say they believe this heartland than they do the one that I prefer, which saddens me. What is fascinating about this one is that although you can put a map to its geography, the strength of this hypothesis has nothing to do with geography. Geography was a late thought. This heartland hypothesis was all built on statements of the prophets that would say that the Lamanites are the people just to the west of us. And so that's taken as a definition. And so when Oliver Cowdery goes to preach to the Sac and Fox Indians, those are going to be the Lamanites because he was sent to the Lamanites. And that means that he was sent to those people. And so it's mostly prophecy. It is heavily rooted in sort of militant patriotism. This is USA. It has to be the right place. Like I say, it really doesn't have much to do with geography at all. And the number of people who believe it, if you try to explain geographic issues to them, they're really not interested. It solves Cumorah for them, and it puts the Book of Mormon in the United States, and that's really the two things that they care about. Now, does that work for trying to find a location for the Book of Mormon? And the answer is no, it really doesn't. So there's a couple of maps. Because this is so important, I'm going to go through a couple of different maps. This is the sort of generic, this is the basic map. The River Sidon is the Mississippi. What you will see happening in the other maps is that the southern part of the Mississippi gets relabeled as a sea because you need to have a South Sea, and so they make the Mississippi into the South Sea. This is the one that uses riverine travel, which is the only way you're going to get from any of these places to any of the other ones, with any kind of human travel, because foot traffic just isn't going to get there. This is a massive amount of location. You're going to have a problem in this one with cities on the West Sea. So if you're going to have to call this one the West Sea in order to have cities there, but there aren't any cities up here. And of course, if you're going to try and get out to the Pacific coast, that's just way too far away. There's no way that that would fit into the Book of Mormon. So they ignore that, and the seas are usually up here. There are times when they will come out to the East Coast, but again, the distances are so long there that it's really hard. What you will find is that they have two places, and they call it putting a pin in the map. And one of the pins that will give you a correct location for a geography of the Book of Mormon is Cumorah, because we know that was in New York. The next place is Zarahemla. They use a verse in the Doctrine and Covenants where they are told to call a particular city across from Nauvoo, to call it Zarahemla. And because that's in the Doctrine and Covenants, they stretch that, call its name Zarahemla to its name must have always been Zarahemla. And that's where Zarahemla was. So frankly, it's a misreading of the scripture, but that's far away from anything that they care about. It gives them a place that they can say Zarahemla was here. Next one, to try and get a little bit more definition. This one, a lot more definition of what's going on. We said that we have a problem with Manti. So Manti is down here. Manti, you could say, has a good defensive position, but only if you're on the south and west side of this river. If you're over here, you can come up this way and go over different rivers, or straight up this, the Sidon, and kind of bypass Manti. So their location for Manti isn't all that good. The Mississippi, of course, is flowing from the north to the south. So the problem we have of the elevation of the land, they ignore that one and don't tell us why this land, well, there's the land of Nephi, Lehi, and they don't tell us why this is higher than over here when this Sidon River is going to flow to the south. So again, they've got some issues. You have bountiful, you have desolation, and of course desolation should be north of. But the Book of Mormon says that there are a lot of people who live in desolation. It's a place where the population covered the face of the earth. Not here. That during Book of Mormon times, you simply don't have that. Let's see, where do we get? Okay, this is the one where we have, I think this is the narrow, or this is the small neck, and up here is the narrow neck. And so you've got two different places. But again, here's Cumorah, and you have to go west to get to the land of desolation. And the Book of Mormon says that Cumorah is in the land of desolation, and that you have to go through that narrow pass, or either this other pass, to get to Cumorah. So again, they really don't care much about geography because it doesn't fit. What they do say about the information in 3rd Nephi is that there was an earthquake with the Madrid Fault, or maybe it's the Madrid Fault. Out in New Mexico, we call it Madrid. And that had, it was just a tremendous earthquake and caused, disruption in the Mississippi. It was felt a long way away. It caused dust to come into the air. And so there are several things that seem to fit. As the geologists look at that one, however, they remind us that in an earthquake, 2 or 3 minutes of an earthquake is really a long time. And the text says that we had the rumblings and earthquakes that went on for hours in the Book of Mormon. So that in itself doesn't fit. The rest of the indications of the volcanic activity, the nature of the tempests, the storms, and the lightnings, all of those fit with volcanic activity. They do not fit with an earthquake. And so we simply don't find those. We don't have active earthquakes up in this area. And slightly different version of the same thing, but you still get desolation, bountiful. You've still got the small neck and the narrow neck, and Zarahemla just got moved up a little bit. But again, the geography itself doesn't work. Now, the next thing, though, is one of the reasons that this becomes popular is that in the early days of the church, a lot of people were looking at the mound builders and associating the mound builders with the people in the Book of Mormon. And this is the region for the mound builders. The mound builders have a couple of different cultures. One is the Adena and the other is Hopewell. And in an older version of the chronology, the Adena would have started in, let's say, a couple of thousand years BC, would have faded out by 600 BC, and the Hopewell pick up at 600 BC, and they tend to be fading out by AD 400. And of course, those timelines really, really sound good for the Book of Mormon. So is it possible, because of the timeline connection, that the Adena would have been the Jaredites and that the Hopewell would have been the Nephites? Well, there's a couple of problems with that. One of them is, you remember that there are relationships that we have to have between the Jaredites, Nephites, and Mulekites, and that there were separations, and that the Jaredites are always north and the Lamanites are south, Mulekites, Nephites here in the center. If you look at the Adena and the Hopewell, they're overlapping. They're all in the same basic places. And what the more recent archaeological information is, they're not sure at all that the Adena were a separate culture or a separate people, but simply that they changed and evolved enough into, made sufficient changes that they basically became the Hopewell. And so there isn't necessarily two different peoples there. It's all the same people, but there was a cultural horizon that got renamed as Hopewell. And so that would take all of the definitions of time out. Next is, do the Hopewell fit at all with what we know of the Book of Mormon? Well, quickest way is to look at agriculture, because you'll remember that one of the things we have to have is large scale agriculture that will have a caloric base that will support a large population. They didn't have it. They did have agriculture, but it did not supply sufficient calories to be anything more than a supplement to hunting and gathering. So basically, they were a hunter-gatherer people that supplemented their diet with home farming and agriculture on sort of a small scale. That fits with the archaeological information that tells us that these Hopewell sites were relatively small, and that you're going to get 300 to 500 people in a site, and perhaps in a really large one up to 1,000. I don't know if you're going to get too much more than that. But basically, these are really small locations. They don't fit the kind of complexity that we see in the Book of Mormon. So the Book of Mormon, in addition to requiring large populations, talk about having kings, and kings that are able to create large building projects. And we just don't see anything like that other than the mounds themselves. And we just don't know what the mounds are doing there. Now, the next thing is that the mounds will have been called forts, and that there are places among them where they'll say, well, this is where there was a fort. And what you will find is that the fort has the description that we find in the Book of Mormon. So you have a borrow pit where they've dug up earth and then they've piled it up. And so you've got a wall and then this borrow pit that's next to it. And that's a pretty typical, defensive work. Seems to be what's described in the Book of Mormon. We see it in other locations. The difference is, if it is a defensive position, the borrow pit is on the outside of the wall, and the ones in the Hopewell are on the inside of the wall, which is exactly the wrong way to build a fort. And nobody who's smart enough to build them as a fort is going to build them backwards like that. Plus, if they're a fort, you're going to find certain kinds of evidence of inhabitants who've been there, military things. These appear to be ceremonial, not military. So they can be called forts, but they're not. One of the other things that happens, unfortunately, with the Heartland hypothesis, they have someone who touts the archaeology, who is not an archaeologist and is trying to find polite words for it, who is known to tout forgeries as evidence for the Book of Mormon. So it is not unusual at all if you see anything about archaeology and North America, you will start to see metal swords and metal hammers. You will see references to the Michigan artifacts, all of those things are known forgeries. And then, of course, using a forgery as evidence for the Book of Mormon really isn't a good idea. All right. The one I prefer, and since we've only got 10 minutes left, we'll probably pick up next week with more of the reasoning behind it. Excuse me. But I follow Sorensen, and I'll give you another Mesoamerican hypothesis to work with, and so you'll see what some of the differences are. This is an area that is going to have reasons why you have to look at it carefully, because obviously, if you know that this is actually north, you've got a problem if you're naming the sea east, the sea north, and down here on the south, you've got the sea west. That is the biggest problem that we have with this particular hypothesis, is that it has become called Nephite north, and it's a skewed north. And everybody goes, well, everybody knows where north is, and nobody's going to make that mistake. So that's an issue that we have to deal with. Other than that, everything else about the geography works pretty well. You've got a land southward down in this area. You have a mountain range that separates the land of Nephi from the land of Zarahemla. There is a pass that comes through here where the Manti would be. You have a river valley in here. The areas up in here that would have been fortified, if there is somebody in this area and it's a Lamanite and he has to get to Manti, he's coming out this way and around, and that's a lot longer than heading up the valley. We've got people in the right places. The land northward is always going to have the Jaredites, and the Nephites and Lamanites are in the south. The Mulekites are always in the center. So all of those things match up. One of the other things that matches up nicely is the volcanic activity. Jerry Grover has looked at this and found a good hypothesis of one or two of the volcanoes that are known to have erupted in the AD 300 range. And you can't date them right to a year, of course, but you've got enough to say that their eruption would have occurred in that reasonable time frame to AD 30 or 33. And that the type of volcano would have created the necessary information. The rest of what we find is that it's highly likely that even in the north, there may have been volcanic activity. There may have been a very big shift along this plate. This is the Ring of Fire. There are a lot of volcanoes down in this area that are still active. And it really, to me, looks like there was volcanic activity both south and north of the land bountiful. Now, problem of directions. We're used to directions that look like a plus sign. So our direction north is always a straight line heading up. The Mesoamericanists did not see it that way. In fact, in most of their languages, they don't have a specific term for north. They have a term for east, they have a term for west. Their terms for north and south are on the right hand or on the left hand. And it will be depending on whether or not your face is toward the sun or your back is toward the sun. Some of the Mesoamerican languages will use their back to the sun and talk about the line that is the east-west line. And then they'll have to the right is north and to the left is south. So what really happens, because it follows the sun, you're going to get this kind of thing, but it sometimes gets regularized to look more like an X than this one, which is really the one that follows the sun. Now, what that does is it means that the definition of the places that are defined by east and west will depend upon where you are getting your reference. So as a simple thing, I live, well, let's see, I've lived in California. So let's take Anaheim, California. Anaheim, California is west of me in Albuquerque. But if I lived and I were in Anaheim, New Mexico, Albuquerque would be east. So the directions really depend on where you are. And what that makes a difference for is if you're getting your directions from the land of Nephi, your East Sea is over here because that's where you're going to find it. And you have a sea to the south of you, you have a sea to the west. The other thing is in Mesoamerican cultures, the East Sea is a place of origin. So if you're going to have any sea, you're going to have an East Sea. So regardless of where it is, you're going to have an East Sea because that's where the sun rises, that's where everything begins. But you'll notice, of course, if you're in the land bountiful and you're talking about your seas, the East Sea is a different sea than it is down there. So you still get all of these directions, they still work. Now, another one, this is for Joseph Allen and his son. They suggest that you really have to have the cardinal directions. And in order to get cardinal directions, you're going to have this straight up and down, and you're going to go into the Peten. And so that works really well because we've still got a lot of the Maya culture. There's high culture there. There's lots of really good ruins. There's lots of cool stuff happening in this area. The problem is that everybody is now realizing that the best explanation for the ending of the Book of Mormon is the invasion of Teotihuacan that's coming down in 8378. We've got that time period where we know that Teotihuacan from up here is coming this way and conquering down here. So the destructive force is north, which means that although this is supposed to be the land northward is down over here. So somehow you've got your cardinal directions right, all except when you have to change it and north has to become west temporarily so that you can get Teotihuacan to come through. So I don't see that one working. I like Sorensen's much better. And then we'll talk, I guess, next week a little bit more about how we can walk through history and time and line up times, places, and cultures to see how that fits history. All right, that gives us enough for the day. Anybody have questions that you would like to ask? I'm looking now at the chat. Then you can take yourself off mute if you want to ask questions. Got to be at least one, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
This is Jeff Faulkner. What in my thinking, the prophets, the authors in the Book of Mormon, had a hemispheric view of directions. The Atlantic Ocean was the East Sea with its inlets, and the Pacific Ocean was the West Sea. And the Gulf of Mexico was just a part of the East Sea. So the Sea North and the East Sea were the same thing to them, Atlantic and Pacific. And so I don't worry about northward and southward, east, west, north, south. To me, it's the seas that determine those directions.
Yeah, and all of that's based on the assumption that they had a hemispheric model. And the problem with that as an assumption is it doesn't work for real people at a real time. Let me give you a story from a friend of mine who was a missionary in Manila in the Philippines. And this was 10 years ago, so not very long ago at all. He was talking about going to get someplace and talking to this native Filipino and trying to tell him how to get to a certain place in the Philippines. And so he tried to show him a map and say, this is how you get there. And the guy looked and he had no clue what it was. And he had to have it explained to him, well, assume you're a bird and you're looking down. The problem is people who don't have the ability to get above a map don't have a worldview that sees the whole map. So for any ancient people to assume a hemispheric model, they have to have somehow traveled We don't have the indication that that's happening in the Book of Mormon. The only time we have any indication that even with sea travel, they might have gone there is going out west with Haggoth and not to the east. So I think you're going to have a hard time saying that the Atlantic was involved at all. It just depends on how you work it.
But we have prophets, and aren't they kind of like shamans? Like the shaman would smoke something, and then he would have a world view. I mean, to have this big vision, and they knew that.
If you have read the prophecies and the sayings of the shaman, none of them are really going to indicate that they have a good indication of geography. If you look at the maps that were created by indigenous people soon after the conquest, you never know where. I mean, east is usually straight up at the top. They'll have the definitions, but it's all defined usually by mountains, and it's not really even defined by seas. You just don't get anything that has a really wide perspective. People are going to see what they see based on what they see on the ground.
Yeah, but these authors like Mormon and Moroni, they were prophets of God. I mean, didn't they have a bigger vision? they
Not that they ever wrote. Now, you know, you can say that a prophet knows everything, but I'm reasonably certain if you were to ask any prophet, they would say, no, they don't happen to know everything. And I don't see any indication in the Book of Mormon that prophets had privileged information about geography beyond what they knew. And in the cases where we get the best geographic information, it's usually Mormon who is inserting texts, and it's based on what his understanding of the geography is, not based on the geography necessarily that's being described in the plate sources he's using. So basically, we're getting Mormon's geography, and particularly when he looks at that land northward in Helaman, we're getting a time frame in Helaman that is much earlier than those descriptions really fit, but they fit Mormon's time. And that again fits with the way, you know, ancient people would understand it. This is what it looks like now. I'm going to assume that's what it looked like when I'm writing a lot earlier. So yeah, I wouldn't use prophets or prophetic knowledge as a reason.
But Mormon saw our time. He saw our time, and he saw the secret combinations. He saw the Gentiles and the great and abominable church and all those things. Why couldn't he see the world globe too? See a satellite image?
I suppose he could. He just never wrote about it. No indication that he wrote about it.
Okay. What about the Liahona?
The Liahona is really interesting because it works to get them to the New World and then it stops. We don't have any place that we know of in the text where it says that the Liahona was working once they arrived in the New World. So it told them how to travel, but once it gets to the New World, apparently it stops and now it becomes a sacred artifact, not a functional artifact.
Was that because of the seer stone that they find, or not the seer stones, but the interpreters? That's what I believe. I can't believe I forgot his name again. The author of the 116 lost pages. I remember hearing him say that kind of took over the Liahona, or the person that had the divine prophecy authority.
Yeah. Don is a little freer with his speculation than I am, which is saying something because I tend to speculate a fair amount. But I try to keep it fairly close to the text. There is simply no indication that we have the interpreters. And the other thing is, the really strange thing about the interpreters is that we know that they are sealed up with the plates of ether, but Mosiah, the son of Benjamin, already has wherewith he can interpret before those interpreters and the plates are given to him. So I don't think that the interpreters were the unique instruments. I think there were other ones, just like Joseph had other instruments. I think the prophets did. But there's simply nothing that we have remaining in the text that will say that they were using those things to give you a wider geography. The only place that I know of where a prophet finds, if you will, geographic information, Captain Moroni goes to Alma and he says, where are the Lamanites headed? And Alma tells him that they're headed to Manti. Other than that, I don't know the prophet saying anything about geography until you get Mormon, of course, who has several descriptions. Let's see, we got a written one here. Artifacts in Central and South America before 600 BC, absolutely. In the United States, dating is from 600 BC. There were artifacts before that as well. So you're going to find, no matter where you go, that was inhabitable land at the time of anybody in the Book of Mormon. The land was inhabited prior to the time the Book of Mormon people would have got there. So there's always artifacts around. There are people all over. So yeah, we're going to find them earlier than 600 BC in any of the locations we look at. Is there any DNA proof? There is no DNA proof of Book of Mormon peoples. I know that Rod Meldrum has touted DNA proof. He is using information that is now at least 20 years old. And even the person who created this source that Meldrum is using has repudiated and said that better information changes it now. So the people who know those sources don't find any DNA connections to anyone in the Book of Mormon anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. And it's not a problem that they don't find them because they came into a land where there was, and I was talking to somebody about this recently. If you get like 30 people and they show up in a population of 5,000 to 6,000, your DNA, by the time you get to the second generation, is already diluted by 50%, and by the third generation, at least 25. You know, it doesn't take long before there's not much of it left. So hardly surprising at all that we don't find it. Oh, the Malay Peninsula. I didn't do that one. The Malay Peninsula is interesting for the same reason that Peru is. It has all of the right sort of cultural things and does a better job at matching up the animals, because you can get elephants and you can get horses. You can get a lot of these different animals over there, and definitely higher culture. The problem is the geography doesn't work. You don't, the closest volcanic activity you find is Krakatoa, and that is on the other side of an island. So even if that's going to erupt, it's, you know, any tsunami that's going to come to bury a city is going to bury Java before it gets to the Malaysian Peninsula. So there's just too many things about that that doesn't work. It was fun though. As far as the way people describe it, it probably gets better descriptions and fits in many ways, as well as many of the other hypotheses that, again, they don't work, but it was kind of a fun one. Okay, nothing else written. We'll turn off the recording.